Chapter 108, Flying Thunder God. After reaching home, Fujin laid the chinin vest he received on his bed and began checking it. The jacket was similar as in the manga. It was green in color. It had 3 scroll pouches on either side of the chest. It also had a neck guard and extra padding over the shoulders. On its back, there was a symbol of Uzushiagakuer. The material that the vest was made of was very resilient. It could provide minor resistances against fire, lightning, weapons, and blunt attacks. Fujin thought, not bad. 6 scrolls plus minor defenses. I wonder if I can inscribe some storage seals on it. Having an easy way to summon hundreds of explosion tags will be handy. Fujin looked at his current clothes and decided, I also need to buy new clothes. The current ones now feel tighter. I'll probably need to keep buying new ones every year for the next few years. Speaking of clothes, Fujin looked around at his house. He had been staying there for almost 7 years. He noticed quite a few cracks on the walls and even the ceiling. He thought, I probably need to change to a new house as well. Practicing wall walking indoors did a number on the walls. Not to mention, it feels much smaller now. I wonder what the property prices are in this world. Fujin decided to look into them later and fell asleep. The next morning, Fujin went to the training ground and began training. He was using the training seal at 60% power. Soon Hoka followed by Miko joined him as well. At 6 a.m., an old man knocked on the door of Hokage's office and entered. Homura looked at Hiruzen and asked, Why did you call me so early in the morning? Hiruzen looked at his friend and answered, I will be training the 3 genins from today for a few days. I will leave the official work to you. Homura's eyes twitched. He was annoyed and asked aggressively, Why do I have to do the paperwork? I'm too old for this. Hiruzen smiled and answered, You made a good contribution to the village by suggesting the idea to reward top performers in the academy. So this is your reward. Homura stared at Hiruzen. Both entered a stare down. After a couple of minutes, Homura sighed. He had heard about a genin asking Hiruzen for a reward during the genin exam. So he understood why Hiruzen was targeting him. He replied, All right, but don't take too long. Hiruzen smiled and said, They are just kids. I'll teach them one jutsu and be done in no time. Homura nodded. Unfortunately for Homura, both he and Hiruzen overlooked one critical aspect. So he'd be stuck doing paperwork for a much longer time than he bargained for. Hiruzen explained some details to his friend before leaving. He wasn't much worried as Homura, Kohaku, and even Danzo had taken over his paperwork job at times, especially during wars. So they all knew how to handle it properly. At 7, Hiruzen arrived at the training ground and saw the 3 genins training hard. He smiled and muttered, They will have a good future if they maintain this dedication. Seeing the Hokage, the kid stopped training and flickered in front of him and wished him good morning. Hiruzen wished them back and praised them for working hard. He asked, So, did you think about which jutsu you want to learn from me? Fujin's eyes sparkled. He was exhilarated and thought, We get to choose? Marvelous. Miko replied, I don't want to learn any jutsu. The Uchiha library has every jutsu. Hoka too shook his head and replied, I also don't want to learn any jutsu. I want to practice taijutsu to master the 32 palms technique. Fujin looked at his teammates with a deadpan expression. Hiruzen laughed. He looked at Miko and said, Watch this. Hiruzen flickered around 50 meters away and made a few hand signs and said, Fire release, Hellfire clap jutsu. Fujin spread his chakra field and observed carefully. Miko and Hoka had activated Sharingan and Byakugan respectively. They noticed a ring of fire forming around Hiruzen. Immediately, the fire spread out in all directions. In less than a second, the fire expanded into a 40 meters radius area around Hiruzen. There were 3 boulders in this area. All were hewn in two. Wherever the fire passed through, nothing was left on the ground. Even the soil turned black. Although the fire was 10 meters from them, all 3 Chunins felt the crazy heat. In 5 seconds, both Fujin and Hoka flickered backwards. After another 5 seconds, Miko also flickered back. Fujin looked at it and exclaimed, "What crazy heat!" They were still sweating. Hoka nodded, "If I were to be hit by it, perhaps even my bones would be left." Miko was too stunned to say anything. The Uchiha clan prided themselves on their fire jutsus. She had seen how strong her parents and elders were. But she had never felt fire as hot as this. Hiruzen smiled on seeing their stunned faces. He dispersed the jutsu and flickered towards them. He said, "As you heard, this jutsu is called Fire Release, Hellfire Clap Jutsu. It is both defensive and offensive in nature. It was created by me during my younger years." He looked at Miko and asked, "Would you like to learn this jutsu?" Miko obediently nodded. Hiruzen smiled and looked at Hoka. He said, "I know you don't like ninjutsu. So I will teach you something that will aid your taijutsu. Look carefully, this is a secret technique of your clan." Chakra began pouring from the chakra points in Hiruzen's right hand. He pulled his arm back and pushed it forward at great speed. While his arm was moving, a vacuum shell formed in his hand. When he pushed his arm to the max, the shell was fired towards a boulder. The shell hit the boulder in the blink of an eye and created a hole through the entire boulder. It kept going and created a hole in 5 trees behind the boulder. The Genins were surprised once again. Hoka had seen this technique before. But he was told that he won't be taught it until he becomes a Jounin. However, the jutsu that he saw his elders perform was nowhere near as lethal as what Hiruzen did. At most, it created strong winds causing a few leaves to fall off a tree. Hiruzen said, "This jutsu is 8 trigrams, air palm. It was invented by the Hyuga clan to create a mid-range fighting capability. It too can be used both offensively and defensively." Fujin gulped his saliva. "I recall reading that Hiruzen could perform every jutsu in Konoha, including the secret techniques. However, that doesn't do Hiruzen justice. It'd be more appropriate to say that Hiruzen can perform all jutsu in Konoha better than anyone else in Konoha." Hiruzen asked, "Do you want to learn this, Hoka?" Hoka immediately nodded. Hiruzen finally looked at Fujin and asked, "Fujin, did you think about any jutsu that you want to learn from me?" Fujin was still surprised by Hiruzen's display. He gathered himself and nodded, "Yes, Lord Hokage." Hiruzen was slightly surprised. But soon he thought, this kid always knows what he wants. So it isn't surprising that he thought of something. I wonder what jutsu he wants to learn. Hiruzen asked, "Which jutsu is it, Fujin?" Fujin said with a serious face, "Lord Hokage, I want to learn the Flying Thunder God jutsu that the 2nd and 4th Hokage used." Hiruzen, who was happy about how shocked the kids were at his abilities, was now shocked himself. Even Fujin could easily notice how shocked and speechless he was. Miko and Hoka were shocked as well. They too looked at Fujin with stunned expressions. Fujin however maintained his straight face and kept looking into Hiruzen's eyes with a hopeful expression. Chapter 109, Senjutsu. Hiruzen smiled bitterly, he really does make the most of every opportunity. He said, "Unfortunately, you can't learn that right now." Fujin showed a thoughtful face and asked, "Why not?" Hiruzen answered, "To learn Flying Thunder God Jutsu, you need two things. You need to be a Fuinjutsu master. For that, you need to learn every Fuinjutsu seal from our library and be able to make them with ease. In our village, there are less than 10 Fuinjutsu masters. Secondly, you need to have a talent for space-time ninjutsu. And that talent is very rare. I am only aware of 5 ninjas from Konoha who had talent in it." Fujin thought for a second and asked, "If I become a Fuinjutsu master, can I be allowed to learn it then?" Hiruzen chuckled and said, "Sure. But learning Fuinjutsu is difficult. I would suggest you not waste time on it right now." Fujin nodded. Hiruzen asked, "Do you have anything else you want to learn?" Fujin nodded once again. Hiruzen was surprised, he even thought of something else to ask if his request was denied. Fujin said, "I heard that one of your students, the Toad Sage Jiraiya of the Sunnins, can use Senjutsu. Can you teach me Senjutsu?" Hiruzen was shocked once again. He wondered, am I getting too old to teach the new generation? Where did he even learn about Senjutsu? Miko and Hoka looked at Fujin with confused faces. "What is Senjutsu?" Hiruzen asked, "Where did you learn about Senjutsu?" Fujin replied, "I read it on a scroll in the library." Hiruzen wondered, did he read every scroll and book there? Hiruzen said, "Unfortunately, I can't teach it to you as I don't know it." Fujin acted surprised and exclaimed, "Even you don't know it? Then could you arr?" Hiruzen cut Fujin off and said, "Just like the Flying Thunder God, you won't be able to learn Senjutsu either. The basic requirement to learn Senjutsu is having a lot of chakra." He then began exerting his chakra, showing it to Fujin. He said, "You will need more chakra than me to be able to learn Senjutsu." Fujin, Miko, and Hoka were surprised at how much chakra Hiruzen had. It was around 150% higher than Renjiro's. Fujin wondered, even at such an old age he has this much chakra? It is almost 18 times larger than my chakra. Fujin sighed thinking, how long will it take me to reach that level? He said, "All right Lord Hokage." Hiruzen had enough of asking Fujin what he wanted to learn. He was afraid of what Fujin might ask next. However, before he spoke, Fujin asked, "Lord Hokage, can you teach me wind vacuum jutsus then?" Hiruzen's eyebrows twitched. He wondered, did he find out about them in the library as well? Fujin looked at Hiruzen thinking, I knew that I couldn't learn Flying Thunder God and Sage Mode. Even if I could, I doubt he would just give me the scrolls or the guidance needed to learn them. Minato probably only got them as he was Jiraiya's student. But if I didn't mention those two and directly mentioned wind vacuum jutsus, it's likely that he would have rejected me due to how dangerous they are. But now that he has already rejected me twice, it's unlikely that he would reject me once more. The only concern left is whether he'd ask Danzo to teach me. But seeing his air palm jutsu, I'm betting that he knows wind vacuum jutsus as well. Even if he asks Danzo, as long as Danzo doesn't make me join the route, I don't care much about him. After all, he doesn't have Shisui's eye yet. And by the time he gets it, the route will be dissolved. Well, at least officially that is. Hiruzen thought around the same lines as Fujin analyzed, wind vacuum jutsu. It is very lethal. Not something I want to teach to little kids. But I have already rejected him twice. Saying no once again won't look good. Not to mention, it is much safer than Senjutsu and Flying Thunder God. He decided to teach him. Hiruzen nodded, all right. I'll teach you wind vacuum jutsus. He realized what he said. Fujin immediately smiled and bowed down, "Thank you, Lord Hokage." Hiruzen looked at the 11-year-old kid with disbelief. "I promised to teach them one jutsu. He made me promise to teach him all the wind vacuum jutsus. And he even thanked me so quickly." Hiruzen sighed internally and decided, "Leave it. I'll teach him and get him off my back for now. Though in the future, I need to ensure that I don't promise him any rewards." Unfortunately for Hiruzen, he had already promised Fujin something for the future. While he didn't think that future would ever arrive, Fujin had already sealed those words in his memory. While Fujin didn't have enough chakra to use shadow clones for training ninjutsu, especially when he was mastering rank B jutsus or supercharging jutsus, he had plenty to abuse while learning Fuinjutsu. As soon as he mastered all Fuinjutsu available, he would ask Hiruzen to aid him in learning Flying Thunder God. By then, he would even have built a good reputation in Konoha, so Hiruzen would be more likely to agree. Hiruzen made a couple of shadow clones. Hoka and Miko went with one each while his main body stayed behind with Fujin. Hiruzen looked at Fujin and said, "Fujin, before I teach you, I need you to promise me something." Fujin asked, "What, Lord Hokage?" Hiruzen replied, "The wind vacuum style is very dangerous. Never use these jutsus on a colleague or an ally. In the future, you would likely spar a lot with other ninjas from Konoha. Under no circumstances are you allowed to use wind vacuum style against them." Fujin nodded and answered without hesitation, "I agree, Lord Hokage. I don't even use my sword while sparring." Hiruzen nodded. It was the main reason why he agreed. He said, "Excellent. I will now first explain the theory of the wind vacuum style. Once you understand, we will begin learning it." Fujin nodded and paid attention. Hiruzen's clones also began teaching Miko and Hoka. Miko had the Sharingan, so she very quickly got the basics of the jutsu. But actually performing it was much tougher as it was in a rank jutsu. She couldn't form the ring of fire around her. Hoka too got stuck in creating a vacuum shell. Both would need some time to overcome those obstacles. However, once they did, they would advance rapidly. Fujin too had a tough challenge to overcome. Chapter 110, Talent. A/N, this double release is sponsored by Terrence Smith on Patreon. You can thank him for it, smiley face. Hiruzen asked, "Tell me Fujin, do you know what a vacuum is and its properties?" Fujin fell into thought. Did the academy ever teach about the vacuum? Probably not, though the library might have some information regarding it. Fujin answered, "Vacuum basically is a space where nothing exists. Not even air. As for its properties, I don't know for sure. But I have a few guesses." Hiruzen said, "That's right. Tell me about your guesses." Fujin replied, "Since nothing exists in a vacuum, the pressure inside the vacuum should be very low, or perhaps non-existent. So if something came close to the vacuum, it would rapidly be sucked inside the vacuum. Though, in that case, the vacuum will no longer be a vacuum." Hiruzen was impressed by that answer. He nodded, "Very good Fujin. You are right. That is how the vacuum works. The wind vacuum jutsus are based on the same principle." Fujin paid close attention as Hiruzen explained, wind vacuum jutsus are the same as normal wind jutsus. The only difference is that they have a vacuum core. So, you first have to learn how to create a vacuum core. Observe properly. Hiruzen extended his arm ahead. Wind formed in his hand, similar to a wind explosion jutsu. Fujin observed with all his focus. A wind sphere formed in Hiruzen's hand. But soon, the winds began moving away from the core. Fujin saw a vacuum sphere forming at the center of the wind sphere. It had a radius of 2 centimeters. Hiruzen explained, to create a vacuum, you just have to remove all air from the space where you decide to create the vacuum. Fujin nodded. The basic principles were similar to those on Earth. Only chakra was used instead of technology. Hiruzen dispersed the jutsu. Fujin noticed as winds rushed back into the vacuum core. Hiruzen said, "Now you try, Fujin." Fujin extended his hand forward. A wind sphere immediately formed in his hand. He focused on the center of the sphere and tried moving air away from it. He quickly managed to move the air to one side of the center. However, soon air from other directions entered. Hiruzen observed him carefully. Fujin struggled for a couple of minutes before making progress. He managed to push the air out from the center in all directions. Slowly, a 1 mm vacuum sphere was formed. Hiruzen noticed. His eyes widened. Fujin didn't see Hiruzen's expression. His entire focus was on the vacuum core. He kept trying to expand its size. He managed to expand it, but multiple times it collapsed. He kept at it. Hiruzen watched with shock on his face. He exclaimed in his mind, "What talent!" Danzo needed a week before he could make a stable core. The way Fujin is going, he'll manage to do it today itself. After overcoming the shock, Hiruzen analyzed the youth in front of him. This kid was talented in the academy, but didn't show any signs of being special. Apart from his higher chakra, all his progress was just a product of dedication. According to Genki, even his higher chakra was a product of hard training. Even his talent in wind jutsu wasn't that great. Could he be like those ninjas, whose talent in a particular nature shows at a later stage? Hiruzen analyzed more. Yeah, there were a lot of ninjas in Kiri and Kyumo whose talent in water or lightning elements showed when working on rank B or higher jutsus. Though the number of similar cases in fire, earth, or wind is very low. Hiruzen rated Fujin's talent very high. He expected Fujin to become at least an elite jounin. However, he still underestimated Fujin's talent. After his death, Fujin's talent in wind manipulation would reach a level that the world would label him a calamity. Fujin was unaware of how much of a shock he had given Hiruzen. His entire focus was on the vacuum core. It needed a very high mastery in chakra control and a very high wind affinity. A few times he managed to increase the radius of the vacuum sphere to 5 mm before it collapsed. After 10 minutes, he finally managed to create a stable vacuum core of a 1.2 cm radius. Hiruzen stared in shock. He sighed in relief thinking, "Luckily I placed him under Renjiro. Otherwise, he wouldn't have become a chunin so early and his talent would have been wasted." Indeed, Fujin was lucky. He had intended to spend all 6 years in the academy and build very strong basics so that his survival chance would be much higher. It was only due to the pressure of his other classmates passing, that he decided to pass early so that he wouldn't attract any unwanted suspicions. If that hadn't been the case, his development would have been stalled by a couple of years. He would have missed the opportunity to gain strength quickly. And would have missed the opportunity to be trained by someone of the same level and dedication as Senju Renjiro. That would have resulted in him not getting any opportunities to learn the Senju Taijutsu style or wind vacuum technique. While he would have eventually learned those techniques, his progress would have likely been delayed by around 3 to 4 years. Hiruzen looked at the vacuum core and said, "Very good. Maintain it for 2 minutes. Fujin didn't reply but followed his instructions. He was able to last 2 whole minutes. Hiruzen was impressed again. He said, Now encase it with winds and aim it at a tree and try launching it as you do with wind explosion jutsu. Immediately winds began forming around the vacuum core. It took the shape of a sphere. Fujin looked at a tree and threw the vacuum sphere. However, as soon as the wind sphere left his hand, the vacuum core began collapsing. By the time it traveled 1 meter, the vacuum core collapsed and air entered it. The wind sphere itself collapsed and dispersed. Fujin was surprised. What the heck? Hiruzen looked and said, after creating the vacuum core, you maintained it? However, when you launched it, you couldn't maintain it anymore. That's why air around it entered the vacuum core and your jutsu collapsed. Fujin analyzed Hiruzen's words and nodded. He asked, so, how can we maintain it when it is away from us? Hiruzen created another wind sphere with a vacuum core and said, watch the wind movement around the vacuum core carefully. He slowly launched the wind sphere towards a boulder. Fujin observed carefully, incredible. The winds are moving in such a way that air doesn't enter the vacuum core. And, there seems to be a thin chakra layer separating the winds and the vacuum core. The wind sphere hit the boulder. The winds only caused a few scratches. However, when the vacuum core touched the boulder, the part where it touched turned into soil and was absorbed into the vacuum core. The vacuum core continued for a few inches absorbing everything around it, before disappearing. It left a 6-inch deep and 3-inch wide hole in the boulder. Hiruzen explained, in order to maintain the vacuum core, you need to do 2 things. First, you need to create a thin film of chakra around the vacuum core to ensure that nothing enters it. And then you need to rotate winds around that film in a way that it doesn't damage the thin chakra film and doesn't allow outside air to hit the chakra film either. When the jutsu hits someone or something, the winds will first damage it and then the vacuum core will hit it. Since the chakra film is thin, it'll break after contact with anything solid or even liquid. As soon as it breaks, the vacuum core will absorb anything it comes in contact with, no matter how tough it is. When it passes through, it'll look like the object is cut into 2. But it isn't a simple cut. Fujin nodded. This technique was very lethal. Hiruzen continued, when you cut someone with your sword, only a thin cut forms in their body. As long as that person isn't dead on spot, a good medic can heal them easily. Even cut arms or legs can be reattached. But with wind vacuum jutsus. Hiruzen pointed towards the hole in the boulder and continued, the vacuum core absorbed everything in a 3-inch diameter. Very few medics can heal such a wound. If it hits any organ, such as the stomach or liver, those organs would be ruined on spot. Surviving is almost impossible. Fujin nodded. Hiruzen's explanation was just as he observed. He thought, damn. Wind vacuum jutsus will be up. Finally, I'll have a way to hit through the enemy defense. He looked at Hiruzen and said, I understand why you asked me to never use this against a comrade, Lord Hokage. Hiruzen nodded with a smile. He wanted to teach Fujin how dangerous these jutsus are. He said, now that the basic theory has been understood, you will have to try it yourself. Let's begin. Fujin nodded and began creating another vacuum sphere with all his attention. Chapter 111, Wind Vacuum Technique. Fujin began practicing. Hiruzen had instructed him to practice with a 1 cm radius vacuum core for now. After creating the vacuum core, he began encasing it with a thin layer of his chakra. It needed delicate chakra control. However, thanks to his Senju Taijutsu style training, his chakra control was good enough. After a few failures, he managed to learn it rather quickly. The next challenge was to form winds around it to add another layer. This time he failed a lot more. If the winds hit the chakra film even a bit, it would collapse. But, soon he managed to create a proper vacuum sphere. In Fujin's right hand, a wind sphere rotated. At the center of this wind sphere was a thin chakra film that encased a 1 centimeter radius vacuum core. Hiruzen thought, incredible. He got the basic form right in less than 10 minutes. Hiruzen said, now throw the sphere at a tree. Fujin nodded and followed his instruction. The vacuum sphere traveled for 10 meters when it suddenly began collapsing. Fujin observed closely and muttered, the winds hit the chakra film and entered the vacuum core. Hiruzen nodded, that is the case. You have to ensure that the winds don't hit the chakra film even when it is traveling. And you need to make the chakra film sturdier while not increasing its thickness. Fujin nodded and began practicing again. For the next 7 hours, Fujin kept experimenting with the wind flow and tried making the chakra film sturdier. Hiruzen kept watching the whole time. He initially watched Fujin with fondness due to how dedicated and hard-working he was. However, after 7 straight hours, he sighed, I expected him to take a break for breakfast and lunch. Instead, he just grabbed a few ration bars and stuffed them into his mouth. He didn't even offer them to me. Hiruzen hadn't carried anything to eat. A couple of times, he had even asked Fujin to take a break. However, Fujin replied, just some time, Lord Hokage. I think I have got a handle on this. After replying, he would get lost in practice and not even look at Hiruzen. He did talk with Hiruzen a few times, but it was regarding issues in the training. After getting the answers, he focused on the training once again. Finally, he managed to get a hang of it. He created another vacuum sphere and threw it in the air. It traveled for around 100 meters in the sky before collapsing. Fujin looked at Hiruzen, who nodded and said, good. This is perfect. Now try it on trees or boulders. Fujin nodded and followed his instruction. He created a vacuum sphere and threw it at a tree. It hit the tree and pierced through it, creating a 2-inch wide hole in the tree. He smiled and began creating more vacuum spheres. In the next few minutes, dozens of trees were pierced. However, every vacuum sphere after piercing the tree would collapse. Fujin wondered, this is definitely good, but if it collapses so soon after piercing a tree, it won't be that lethal. Maybe creating a bigger vacuum core might help it go longer. Hiruzen wasn't aware of Fujin's thoughts. He looked at his performance and praised him, great work Fujin. However, let's stop here for today. Fujin looked at Hiruzen and protested, but Lord Hokage, I can still train. Hiruzen shook his head and said, your chakra is almost exhausted. If we train more, then you might not be able to train tomorrow. The next step of training will be just as challenging as today's. So let's stop for today. Fujin reluctantly nodded. Hiruzen instructed, don't practice wind vacuum style in my absence. Preferably, don't use any more jutsus today and meditate to recover your chakra quickly. We will meet tomorrow at 7 a.m. as well. Fujin nodded and thanked Hiruzen for his help. Hiruzen smiled and left thinking, finally I can have some food. Didn't expect him to train continuously for so long. His teammates left after a couple of hours of training. Still, to get the basic version of wind vacuum style down in a third of a day. Fujin is very talented in wind release. He chuckled thinking, I wonder how Danzo would react when he knows that an 11-year-old kid learned in under 8 hours what he needed 9 days to learn. After leaving, Fujin went to the shopping area for ninjas. He entered the same clothing shop as he did almost a year ago. Fujin asked the shopkeeper to make similar clothes for him as the ones he was wearing, but tailored to his current measurements. The shopkeeper took Fujin's measurements and commented, "You are doing well, kid. You've gained 4 inches in less than a year." Fujin replied, "Yes, thank you." The shopkeeper smiled and said, "I saw you in the Chunin exams. You were amazing. Congrats on winning the tournament." Fujin nodded. After taking the measurements, the shopkeeper asked, "I have one product to show you. Most ninjas buy this from me." Fujin asked, "What product?" The shopkeeper picked up a box and opened it. He took out something that looked like chainmail armor. Fujin checked it. It felt very sturdy. It would be able to block stray shurikens and kunaus as long as they weren't enhanced with chakra flow. It would likely reduce damage from shurikens and kunaus thrown directly at him as well. When combined with Chunin vest and shirt, it's likely that normal shurikens would find it difficult to hurt him. Of course, the rest of the body will still be vulnerable. The shopkeeper said, "This is a mesh upper body suit." "It is." Fujin cut him and said, "I'd like 2 sets of this as well." The shopkeeper nodded and said, "All right, it'll take us around a week to make everything for you. So visit me after a week." Fujin nodded and left. The next day, Fujin once again began warming up while waiting for Hiruzen to show up. Hoka, Miko, and Hiruzen all arrived slightly before 7 a.m. The group split up once again, with Hiruzen's main body staying with Fujin. Hiruzen instructed, "First, let's check what you have learned so far. Use a couple of vacuum spheres on that boulder." Fujin followed his instructions and tossed a couple of vacuum spheres on the boulder one after another. The first one pierced more than halfway through it, while the second one pierced through it. Hiruzen said, "Good. What are your thoughts about the wind vacuum style?" Fujin thought for a bit and said, "It is very strong in terms of piercing capability. But, the vacuum core collapses soon after hitting the first target. So even if this technique pierces through any defense, it won't be able to harm the ninja hiding behind those defenses." He looked at Hiruzen and said, "I wonder if increasing the size of the vacuum core will resolve this." Hiruzen replied, "Good analysis. But no. Once the vacuum core begins absorbing, it'll collapse quickly." Fujin frowned, "I don't remember too well, but I think Danzo's vacuum jutsus kept traveling even after piercing rocks. Will that not be the case here?" Hiruzen smiled seeing Fujin analyze with a frown. He said, "But, there is a way around this to make the wind vacuum jutsu last much longer and hit multiple targets in its path." He extended his right arm towards a tree and said, "Watch." Fujin observed carefully as a vacuum sphere formed in Hiruzen's palm. His eyebrows furrowed. The vacuum core was different, but he couldn't understand what exactly was different. Hiruzen launched the vacuum sphere. It pierced through the tree, but maintained its form and kept going ahead. Fujin watched with eyes widened as the vacuum sphere pierced through 13 trees before collapsing. He just exclaimed, "Wow." Hiruzen smiled with satisfaction at seeing Fujin's reaction. Fujin asked, "The vacuum core looked different. What did you do?" Hiruzen extended his arm ahead and said, "Observe carefully again." A small vacuum core slowly began forming in Hiruzen's palm. A 1 centimeter radius vacuum core was formed. A thin film of chakra then encased it. However, instead of forming winds around it, vacuum began forming around the chakra film. While this vacuum was being formed, chakra began extending out of the thin chakra film. The vacuum outside the chakra film encased it entirely, but it was divided into 6 equal parts. Between those 6 parts, chakra flowed. In addition, thin threads of chakra existed even within these 6 vacuum parts. They looked similar to veins. Hiruzen walked towards a nearby tree while saying, "Follow me and observe what happens when this hits the tree." Fujin followed him. Hiruzen slowly pressed this vacuum core against the tree's trunk. The trunk began disintegrating and getting absorbed in the vacuum. However, after entering the vacuum, it drifted towards the chakra in between the vacuum. After entering the chakra flow, they were thrown out of the vacuum core. Fujin was surprised. He said, "The absorbed materials are thrown out. So the vacuum core is maintained. And the central-most vacuum core was never even hit." Hiruzen dispelled the jutsus and nodded, "This way, you can maintain the vacuum core for longer. Once you master this, your enemy will have to dodge your jutsu, as blocking them will be near impossible." Fujin nodded and grinned, "This looks very lethal." "Thank you, Lord Hokage." Hiruzen smiled and said, "Now you try creating such a vacuum core." Fujin nodded and got to work. Chapter 112, Bonding with the Hokage. Fujin kept working on creating the complicated vacuum core. He managed to encase the chakra film inside another vacuum layer very quickly. But dividing it into 6 parts was difficult. He kept trying for the next 3 hours without success. Hiruzen looked at Fujin while thinking, "I didn't intend to teach this to Fujin. After all, even the normal vacuum core is very lethal. Danzo and I needed months to perfect this." However, he learned the normal wind vacuum style in under a day. I am looking forward to how quickly he can master this. At 10, an Umbu appeared behind Hiruzen. This broke Fujin's concentration and he observed him. The Umbu greeted Hiruzen, "Lord Hokage." And he handed him a tiffin box. Fujin, who had just eaten a couple of ration bars, was amused. The Umbu left after Hiruzen took the box and thanked him. Hiruzen looked at Fujin and said, "Fujin, come join me." As it'd be impolite to turn him down, Fujin joined him. Hiruzen opened the box, and there were a few sandwiches in it. Fujin sat down and picked up one piece. While eating he said softly, "I didn't know the Umbu were responsible for this as well." Hiruzen laughed and replied, "He is a part of my personal guard. They do everything that I ask them to." Fujin nodded while thinking, "Well, except for paperwork." Seeing that Fujin wasn't taking any initiative to converse, Hiruzen asked, "So Fujin, what do you usually do?" Fujin replied while taking a bite, "Pretty much just train, eat and sleep, Lord Hokage. Before the Chunin exams, Renjiro-sensei would train me all day." Hiruzen knew that. He smiled and said, "No need to keep calling me Lord Hokage. You can call me Grandpa." Fujin got a bit worried, "What is this old fox planning?" He showed an enthusiastic face and said, "All right Grandpa." Hiruzen smiled on hearing that. Since he didn't have anything to talk about with Fujin, Hiruzen began telling him old stories from his own experiences. Fujin listened carefully. After all, Hiruzen's record as a ninja was just too good. Very few could say that they were stronger than him. As for his experience, it'd be difficult to find anyone in the ninja world to have a richer experience than him. Perhaps only Onaki could claim to have a similar level of experience. After breakfast, Fujin once again kept trying without any success. They took a similar break around 1 p.m. for lunch. And trained till 4 p.m. The next few days were spent in this manner. Fujin kept improving his vacuum core but didn't reach a satisfactory level. Hiruzen kept monitoring and giving him tips. Over breakfast and lunch, Fujin took initiative to ask for more such stories. He, especially, asked a lot about Hashirama and Tobirama. After Hiruzen ran out of stories to tell about them, Fujin asked about the second Kazekage, third Raikage, Heitake Sakumo, and the Sunins. He initially started asking them in a way to show that he idolized the past Hokages. But as Hiruzen told more, the conversations became about their techniques. How they created them. How Hiruzen or someone else countered them. Of course, Hiruzen noticed the change in the conversation. But he didn't mind. After all, if he were to tell these stories to any other kid, they would get bored and fall asleep. Having a good listener who would ask a lot of questions was something he liked. At one point, Fujin asked Hiruzen, "Grandpa, how do you counter the Sharingan in combat? Is avoiding eye contact the only counter?" Hiruzen asked, "Doesn't your teammate have Sharinans?" Fujin nodded, "Yes. And every time I fight her, I maintain my distance and fight her with clones. Unlike Hoka, who I can engage in close combat, I prefer to let my clones do the fighting against Miko." Hiruzen nodded. He had seen their fight. He said, "The advantage of Sharingan is that they can cast genjutsu very quickly. However, even if it is very quick, they still need a fraction of a second to use the genjutsu. While not looking into their eyes or fighting with clones works, they are quite restrictive. The better way is to sense when they would use Sharingan genjutsu. And right before they cast it, disrupt your chakras so that you can't be placed under genjutsu." Fujin furrowed his eyebrows and asked, "But how can we sense that quickly?" Hiruzen replied, "You can focus chakra in your eyes. It enhances your vision and can allow you to see chakra. Since you are a sensor, you should be able to see the chakra. It is what Sakayumi was doing in the Chunin exam." Fujin exclaimed, "Oh, I didn't think that would work." Hiruzen replied, "Yes. But it isn't easy. You first need to know how their chakra changes before they cast genjutsu. And be quick enough to realize it and disrupt your own chakra. However, even this isn't foolproof. There are some Uchiha who are capable of casting very powerful genjutsu. Even if you detect and disrupt your chakra, you would still be caught in the genjutsu." Fujin frowned on hearing that. He wondered, is he talking about the Manjikyo or does he mean that even normal Sharingan can be used to cast such a strong genjutsu? Hiruzen noticed Fujin frowning and said, "But there is no need to worry. After all, the Uchiha are a part of Konoha." There was a hint of helplessness and sadness in Hiruzen's tone. The relations between Konoha and Uchiha were deteriorating day by day. Fujin didn't notice that. He sighed internally, "Yeah, I wish. Even without the coup, the strongest Uchihas are already against Konoha. No, they are against the entire ninja world." Hoka and Miko also kept up their training. Hoka was the first one to learn his technique. It took him 3 days to learn. However, the power of his vacuum palm was quite weak. Hiruzen provided him insights on how to improve the power and their training ended. Miko managed to learn her jutsu on the 5th day. Hiruzen spent another couple of days with her to improve her mastery of the jutsu. He gave her a lot of good advice and proper guidance. After all, Hiruzen was hoping that this act would improve his relationship with the Uchiha. The Uchihas did appreciate the Hokage for teaching his original jutsu to Miko. Unfortunately, with the village turning a deaf ear to their demands, their resentment didn't decrease. Later, Hiruzen would try to remove the surveillance on the Uchiha and move them back into their previous territory. Unfortunately, his plans would be opposed by Danzo and the 2 elders. Losing the 4th Hokage to a Sharingan-controlled Kyuubi was a huge blow to the village. With Minato no longer alive, if something similar were to happen, then the other village would probably invade Konoha. The elders wouldn't risk that. So the fate of the Uchiha clan wouldn't change. Chapter 113, there are no wind vacuum jutsus. Unlike Hoka and Miko, Fujin's training continued. It was on the 9th day that he finally managed to create a similar vacuum core as the one Hiruzen had created. Hiruzen checked it and praised Fujin, "Very good. This is good enough. Now, encase this vacuum core with another thin chakra film, and then create winds around it." Fujin followed his instructions and got it right on his first try. He threw it at a tree. It pierced through it and pierced 8 more trees behind it before collapsing. Fujin grinned, "This is great. Thanks, Gramps." After 9 days of training, Fujin was now very casual with Hiruzen. Of course, he still kept proper control over what he spoke and didn't antagonize Hiruzen. Hiruzen nodded, "Very impressive, Fujin." Fujin looked at Hiruzen and asked, "Can we learn all the wind vacuum jutsus now?" Hiruzen showed a confused face and asked, "What do you mean by wind vacuum jutsus?" Though Hiruzen had a confused face, he was laughing internally while thinking, "This brat has taken a lot of advantages from me." Unfortunately, even if he read the entire library, his knowledge won't compare to mine. Fujin's eyebrows twitched. He asked, "Aren't there a bunch of wind vacuum jutsus?" Hiruzen chuckled and shook his head, "There are no wind vacuum jutsus. Wind vacuum is a technique to create a vacuum core inside a wind jutsu. So some wind jutsus can become wind vacuum jutsus by using a vacuum core. For instance, the vacuum sphere is just a modified wind explosion jutsu." Fujin was surprised at this. "Oh, I didn't think of it that way." Hiruzen was about to ask Fujin to experiment on his own and create his own wind vacuum jutsus, when Fujin looked at him and said, "Grandpa, could you guide me in how to add the vacuum core in the Great Breakthrough Jutsu?" Hiruzen's face went slightly black at how quickly Fujin requested him. He coughed and said, "No. The vacuum core can't be added to the Great Breakthrough Jutsu due to it having such a wide area of attack." Fujin replied, "Oh. I read that the second Kazekage used a jutsu called Vacuum Bullet Jutsu. The scroll said that it moved at a very high speed and was very hard to dodge. Can you teach me that, Grandpa?" He looked at Hiruzen with a hopeful look on his face. While Fujin didn't like Hiruzen's diplomacy, he had nothing but respect for Hiruzen's power and experience. Now that he had a chance to hold his thigh, Fujin would take every advantage he could from Hiruzen. Having interacted with Fujin for so long, Hiruzen understood that Fujin's expressions were fake. He decided, "I definitely need to include him in negotiating teams. He is aware that I know that his expression is fake. But he still does them." Hiruzen sighed and agreed. Using wind bullets needed one to create small vacuum cores inside their mouth. While they were mostly harmless, they could result in horrible injuries if something went wrong. Hiruzen sighed thinking, "I don't think Homura will agree to take over paperwork for me again. When will those students of mine return to take my hat?" As Hiruzen wished, one student of his would eventually return to take his hat. Though, he would want Hiruzen's head alongside his hat. Hiruzen looked at Fujin and said, "For that, you will first need to learn air bullet jutsu." Fujin replied, "Oh, can you teach me that jutsu as well?" Fujin noticed Hiruzen's face going black. Hiruzen wasn't surprised as he expected Fujin to immediately make this request. However, he couldn't help but wonder, was this boy born with no shame? Hiruzen showed Fujin the hand signs for air bullet jutsu and explained how it worked. Fujin managed to perform it after a couple of tries. He improved his mastery of the jutsu for half an hour. This jutsu was very lethal as well. If used against an army, it'd have a terrifying effect. However, any good defense would easily block it. While practicing, Fujin wondered, why wasn't this jutsu placed in the library? Hiruzen then taught Fujin the modified hand signs for vacuum bullet jutsu. Of course, the hand signs alone won't help to use this jutsu, as Fujin first has to learn to create a vacuum core inside his mouth. Hiruzen first showed it to Fujin. The vacuum core for this wasn't a sphere. It was shaped like a bullet, but much thinner. The outer layer was once again fragmented into parts separated by chakra, while the inner core was a proper vacuum. Fujin began practicing. He faced two challenges. The first was that he was creating it inside his mouth rather than his hand, so he couldn't see it and had to work based on just feeling it. Another issue was chakra control. Controlling the chakra was a lot easier when done with the palm. Controlling it inside his mouth was challenging. Hiruzen was aware of this as well. The ideal time to train this would have been after Fujin began using the vacuum sphere very smoothly. However, seeing Fujin's talent, Hiruzen was interested in seeing how quickly Fujin would learn this. Besides, he was happy to not go back to paperwork for a few more days. Fujin trained till he ran out of chakra. This time, instead of dismissing Fujin, Hiruzen said, "Follow me, Fujin." Hiruzen flickered. Fujin followed him. They left the training ground and entered a remote area in Konoha. There was a small house with smoke coming out of a chimney. Hiruzen stopped in front of the house. A few seconds later, Fujin appeared. Fujin asked, "Who lives here, Grandpa?" At that time, Fujin heard a loud noise of metals clashing. Fujin asked, "Is this the blacksmith?" Hiruzen smiled and knocked on the door. The sound stopped. Soon, a middle-aged man opened the door. He wasn't surprised to see Hiruzen. He bowed and greeted, "Welcome to my home, Lord Hokage." Hiruzen smiled and said, "Hello Momo, how are you doing?" The middle-aged man was Oda Momo. He was a blacksmith living in Konoha. He had a special position in Konoha due to his connections. Oda Momo replied, "I'm doing well, Lord Hokage." "Come in." He invited Hiruzen in. Hiruzen and Fujin entered his home. On entering, Fujin saw an old man. He wore a white robe, had a long white beard and long white hair. However, he was quite well built for his age. Hiruzen greeted him, "Fujidano. I trust you have been doing well." Furatani Fuji greeted him back, "I have been doing well, Lord Hokage. It's good to see you once again." Hiruzen and Fuji exchanged some pleasantries. Furatani Fuji was a very reputed blacksmith from the land of iron. He was one of the very few blacksmiths alive who could forge chakra metal weapons. Once every year, he would visit Konoha to take orders for new weapons. Momo saw his Hokage and mentor exchange greetings like old friends. He felt very proud. After all, not everyone could boast about having the Hokage visit their home every year. After finishing their small talk, Fuji looked at Fujin and said, "So this is the youngster who wants swords?" Hiruzen nodded and said, "Yes, he wants samurai sabers which aid in wind chakra flow." Fuji looked at Fujin for a few moments. He stared at his swords and asked, "Can I see your current progress with chakra flow?" Fujin looked at Hiruzen, who nodded his head. Fujin unsheathed both his swords and flowed his chakra through them. He then changed it to wind nature. Fuji observed for a few seconds before nodding, "Very impressive. Your basics are solid." Fujin politely replied, "Thank you." Fuji got up and asked Fujin to follow him. Momo and Hiruzen also followed. They entered a room with a lot of swords. Fuji looked at Momo and said, "Bring a few swords for Fujin to check." Fujin checked out quite a few swords. Fujin was the most comfortable with a 2 feet long sword. However, Fuji and Hiruzen recommended longer swords that would fit him properly when he grew up. After all, he was only 11. In the end, they settled on two 2.5 feet long, 1 inch wide, dual-edged swords. Fuji said, "All right. I'll make and bring those swords next year." Fujin was stunned. He said softly, "Next year?" Hiruzen chuckled and said, "He is one of the best swordsmiths in the world. He can only make one trip to Konoha every year." Fuji added, "In addition, adding chakra metal to swords is very complicated. It takes a long time to do it." Fujin nodded disappointedly as he couldn't do anything about it. Hiruzen said, "You can leave, Fujin. I have some official matters to discuss with Mr. Fuji." Fujin nodded and left. After leaving, he sighed thinking, 1 year. So long to make a sword. That said, it shouldn't matter much. My current swords are good enough for the time being. He went to the clothing shop and took his new clothes. On reaching home, he swapped his old clothes for new ones and tried them. The shopkeeper had done a good job. The clothes fit him perfectly. Especially the mesh upper bodysuit. It was very comfortable. The training continued from the next day. Hiruzen and Fujin talked about even more techniques and strong ninjas. After Fujin ran out of techniques to discuss, he even asked questions about the Great Ninja Wars. He asked what started them, how they could have been avoided, whether any wars will happen in the future and how they could be avoided. This talk surprised Hiruzen. Fujin surprisingly showed maturity way beyond his age. Memories of the maturity attack showed surfaced. Fujin had realized that Hiruzen would realize this. He had intentionally shown it. In the future, he would require a lot of S-rank jutsus that Konoha had. Increasing his value in Hiruzen's eyes had a lot of merits. While Fujin did create a personal bond with Hiruzen over the past week, however, Fujin was aware that this bond won't gain him many benefits. After all, Naruto's bond with Hiruzen could be said to be much deeper. However, he didn't receive any benefits from Hiruzen. Other than perhaps getting a strong Jounin sensei. Though, even that decision was likely not an emotional one. These talks made Hiruzen finalize his decision to invite Fujin into the Umbu ranks after a few months.